How's everybody this morning? All right, terrific. It is wonderful to be back in my old stomping grounds. I'm originally from Illinois, but I spent 17 years right here in Jacksonville, Florida. Anybody from Jacksonville? Any local people here? A couple people, all right. So I spent 17 years here. In fact, there's a sister club, The Lodge, that's down the street, and I was a member of that club for about 10 years. So we spent lots of time here. And speaking of practical jokes, I think my team does this practical joke on me. I'm on to this. And so I mentioned I was here 17 years, but now I'm in California. I'm in San Diego. But it seems that every time I come back to the East Coast to speak, I'm always 8 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, which is, 5, 10 for me now. So I'm on to you all about, that's all they had. I'm on to this. So next year, I'll be the lunchtime speaker. So we're going to talk about trends. Everybody's talking about trends. I understand you learned a little bit about some of the trends that are affecting us. By us, I mean this whole HR space. You'll see some themes. Hopefully, if we're right about this, you'll see some overlapping themes. But I might have a little bit of a different approach to this. So every year at Ultimate Software, we do these trends that are affecting HR tech. But we start off by kind of looking on the outside. What are these global trends that are affecting society? And then we kind of translate that to the workplace. How does that affect us and the work that we're doing in our organization? So for this year, this is, like hot off the presses. You're one of the first audiences to see this. There is, surprisingly for a lot of people, this global labor shortage. It's happening right now in terms of the number of people who are unemployed. That rate is lower than available jobs, right? And it's interesting when you see the projections because of the age demographics, how they're shifting, and I have some more on that. Trust crisis. I'm sure it's not the case for organizations in here, but people are having this crisis of trust. They don't trust the entities that they have for so long. Again, we'll go into details in each one of these, but there's a tremendous opportunity for us in our organizations here. So we're looking at the positive side of that, and sustainability. We've talked about AI. For the labor shortage, so how do we respond to that? How does that impact us and the work that we do? Well, we got to focus on accessibility. We have people that are not in the game now. And so we'll talk about how can we bring all of our talent to the table? How can we get people in the game that are not to deal with this labor shortage? And in terms of the trust crisis, well, in some ways, that's organizations doing, right? We have not always made the best use of people's data, use it in a way that would encourage trust. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And it's not just data privacy. We'll talk more broadly about that. And then sustainability. So you got the age of AI. Things are changing so fast. How can an organization stay sustainable? How can an organization stay relevant? And it's about being adaptable. We always talk about the adaptive workplace. How can we have organizational adaptability? And we're bringing it to the individual level. Let's look at the workforce from a people-first standpoint. How can we make them more adaptive? How can we make them adjust more easily to these changes that are happening at warp speed? So I mentioned this labor shortage. So if you look at that trend, we've never had this where these lines have crossed, that you have all these jobs available and you don't have people to fill those jobs. And it's interesting, where would you think most of the jobs are that are just wide open that we can't fill? Where would you think they are? Technology, high tech. Interesting. Look at this. Now, the first one is application development, but look at the rest of them. You see a theme there? Really interesting. And part of this is because of the aging population, right? People are getting older, they're living longer. Doesn't mean they're healthier, they're living longer, but they have some challenges. Here's the other part that gets missed, and I can do a whole nother discussion about this. I actually ran a clinical trial with the Mayo Clinic here in Ponte Vedra, where we help people transition their diet to a more plant-based diet to help them avoid chronic health disparities. What gets missed, I think, in all these discussions is that not just older people are being more unhealthy, But our regular workers, right, younger people are more likely to have chronic health disparities. Half of Americans have a chronic health issue, like a significant, serious, life-threatening kind of a chronic health issue. Half of Americans. So in our workplaces, more and more of our employees in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s are having these chronic health issues. Some of it will lead to disability, as we'll talk about. But we got to figure out, how to manage this. We're at a case now, I think Gen Xers are the first generation whose long-term health projections are going to be worse than their predecessors. It's the first time that ever happened. Every generation gets healthier. So this is an area that we're going to end up talking about more and more that, have some overlaps with technology, but not necessarily a technology thing. I just find that interesting. Here's another thing. People are saying, forget the traditional work, right? We've all heard about the gig economy, and so many people, either they're making it their primary source of income, or it's their little quote-unquote side hustle, I think is one of the commercials talked about. So this is a challenge that we will continue. It's just kind of a way of life. I talked about the demographics are shifting. So look at this. For the first time in history, so we're saying a lot of things for the first time in history. Persons age 65 plus outnumber children under 5 globally. And so those, you'll see that gap. And at some point, that gap hits the workforce. And so if you look around 2040, 2050, most of these economies are going to be experiencing these labor shortages. So we're going to have to figure out if the traditional source of labor is shrinking, what are we going to do? I talked about the trust crisis. Now, when I look at this slide, I see opportunity. So people don't trust the organizations that they traditionally have trusted for years. But who do they trust? They trust their own employer. The other guys, they're unethical. But this company, I have some faith in you. So it's an opportunity, but it's a tremendous responsibility. Because if we breach that trust, it hurts more. They trust, it's like being in a relationship, right? Somebody who you thought cared about you, when they do something, it's going to hurt more than those other people who you already didn't have high expectations of. And so there's a tremendous opportunity, but again, tremendous responsibility for organizations to understand that in some cases, the organization is the only people that person trusts. And from a sustainability standpoint, this is interesting. So as much as we have this new technology that has really boosted our productivity over the years, look at what has started to happen. Productivity has started to plateau and is declining. And so in some ways, the machines can't save us. They can do some things, obviously, right? But we can't rely on AI. We can't rely on automation because we're not seeing the numbers translate into this higher level of productivity. It seems like we're filling these gaps with some other things that might not always be the most efficient, most useful thing. So what do we do in this case? What do we do? We got to really rethink when we bring people to the table. In HR, we've always said, look, it's not just about technical skills. You got to think about these quote-unquote soft skills. And nobody listened. People are starting to listen a little bit more. This is kind of like not a nice to have anymore. We're going to have a different set of skills in a workforce if people are going to be adaptive. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I think that's the only way that we can have continued productivity. So focus on disability. By the way, this was a new one for me as we were working on this presentation, A11Y. Have you all seen that kind of an acronym for disability? Maybe I was just late on that. So for accessibility, A11I, 11 letters. Anyway, we need new sources. I'm kind of old school, so we need to rethink how we think about accessibility. It's not just, for people who are in a wheelchair or something like that. There are other people who are impacted. It impacts everybody. Strollers, people carrying different kind of. We just got to think more broadly. How can we make this physical place, this physical space, more accessible for people? And then we got to get beyond that in some ways, from a psychological standpoint. So certainly we need to do more in the traditional sense around accessibility. 15% identify as having some kind of disability. So this is not just a handful of people. And look at the employment rate or the unemployment rate. These are people who can work, right? I can do that job, and we don't even look at them. They're severely underemployed, partly because of stigmas that we have or just our lack of creativity to figure out how to accommodate different people. This is interesting. This is Uber. I don't know if you all have seen this in some airports for people who are visually impaired to make this more accessible for them to get Uber. We've talked more about this concept of neurodiversity. So when I'm doing discussions around diversity and inclusion, I try and make sure to include this because it's something that's critically affecting our workplace. And look at this, 85% of college grads affected by autism unemployed. They're college grads. They were able to focus, enough to graduate college and perform. They can take those skills to the workplace. But we just haven't tapped into that resource. So again, woeful unemployment there. This is going to be interesting. So people, as we talked about this workforce aging, while we've had a lot of boomers raise their hand to retire, we have a lot of people saying, look, either I can't retire or I don't want to retire. There's even people writing about the fact that retirement may not be even a concept in the future. Because people are going to be around a lot longer, they're moving into a new life stage, which means in the workplace, we're going to have to make some accommodations for people who may be differently able, right, as they get a little bit older. So when you focus on accessibility, what does that mean? You got to expand your thinking. Now, I want you to think about this in a sense too. I mentioned that, look, we got to get the whole team in the game, and we think about accessibility as it relates to people with disabilities. We have other populations, though, that are woefully underemployed. People of color. I think about East St. Louis, Illinois, where I'm from, almost 100% black population, high unemployment rate. How do we make the workplace accessible for people like that? People that we have somehow marginalized. There are some industries where there's just no women, right? They're just not there. So how do we make the workplace accessible for women to come into places where they have not traditionally been? So in my mind, when I'm thinking about accessibility, I'm thinking about, who's not in the game, and how do we get them in the game? How do we examine the systems and the structures that are causing this to happen? So we got to rethink belonging. So again, what does this labor employee, what does this contract look like? This employer-employee contract? What does it look like? Is it always full-time? Do I recognize they have gig things? Do I hire teams to work on certain projects? And this whole thing, we have to think about a little bit differently. Reassess real qualifications. So what is a real, a bona fide, occupational qualification? What's real? What is real in our organizations? We say people should be able to do a certain thing that they're never going to do. Is that a real qualification for their job? Here's another thing. As we think about making the workforce, making the workplace more accessible for people, are we valuing things like resilience? So just think about this. You're hiring somebody for a job. You're looking at their resumes. You have, test scores, qualifications of person A are right here. The test scores, qualifications, experiences for person B are right here. Here's the minimum that you need. Both of them are over that minimum. Person A is here, person B is here. Person B is from East St. Louis, like me. Didn't have private schools, didn't have tutors, might have had some family challenges, whatever those challenges have been. I mean, isn't resilience, are people going to face stress in our workplaces? Right? So wouldn't the ability to deal with stress, the ability to overcome stress, the ability to work through stress, the ability to bounce back up from failure, aren't those critical skills? And in fact, is that skill going to last longer than this new technology that's going to be obsolete in, a number of months, maybe years? So we need to think about that. I don't think we have ways in our organizations today to account for that. We're going to be in the lead of that, and we're going to have to figure that out. We're sitting in the right spot to help figure that out. So obviously, advancing technology, I mentioned that automating things is important. Got to automate what we can, but it's more about augmentation, right? How do we amplify what makes people human? And how do we then figure out how to make them more productive? And I have a slide to talk about that a little bit later. Well, we know that when we don't do this, from a compliance standpoint, it can be costly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on compliance because I want us to be past compliance, right? I'm trying to think about creative ways that this shouldn't even come into question, but certainly it's an issue. It's an issue if we're not complying. We thought this was a great quote from Anita B. I'll let you just take a look at it. It's kind of similar to what I've talked about. How do we make this more accessible to everybody? Again, we're playing a game, and we have a lot of talent just sitting on the bench, and we're losing the game. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So this trust crisis and how it is that maybe we can overcome this trust crisis by striking the right balance between having people's information, making it readily available to them, but protecting it at the same time. So again, people have lost faith in their traditional organizations. They've been burned. In many cases, it's been, and here's the deal too. When these things have happened, because we find out everything real time, it's all magnified, right? It's not that people just start doing unscrupulous kinds of things, right? It's just that now, when you do it, everybody knows about it. And so people feel like, look, I don't have any kind of control over how my personal information is being used. I like the convenience of having these tools that know who I am and can kind of predict what I want and need and have that customized to me. I like that convenience, but I'm not sure about what I have to give up to get that convenience. So people are having this struggle. I know personally I'm having that struggle. I just built a new house, and it's a smart house, and I'm like, man, they're just finding out everything about us from the time we wake up to. I don't know how I feel about that, but I do like pushing that button and having the vacuum cleaner clean everything. So it's a balance. It's a balance. So how do you overcome this? How do you overcome this? Well, you got to be trustworthy. You got to be trustworthy, and being authentic, being open, being transparent are all keys to being trustworthy. And communicate with me. That's always been a hallmark of mine as an HR professional. I've always tried to at least be as upfront and be as proactive about communicating as I could, because there were things that I couldn't say, and you're in that same situation. There are things that we can't share. But if we share the things that we can, then when it's something that we can't talk about, people will understand. But if we're always, walking around like, hey, people are not going to trust what's going on. They're not going to trust what's going on. So there is some research that talks about how this is important. 2.5 times more likely to be leaders in revenue growth, outperform customer loyalty. So these are organizations where the trust in the leadership is very high. So, there are some numbers attached to this as well. I mentioned before that as you talk about these soft skills that we have talked about, at least in the 20 years I've been in HR, people didn't listen in the past. We had a hard time trying to quantify some of this stuff in the past. Because of technology now, we can quantify the impact of these soft skills a little bit more. So to the degree that we can, as HR professionals, we got to be able to tell a story two ways. There's this qualitative story we can tell. This is how it feels. But there's this quantitative story that we have to be able to tell as well. And we didn't necessarily have the tools to do that. And now we have the tools, or at least the tools are available, We just haven't fully utilized them as a function. And, you know, in some ways, we're still trying to mature as a function. And part of that maturation process, I think, has been able to bring these tools in and to use the data to measure some of this stuff that heretofore we couldn't. So people, all this stuff is important. This trust is important. People say they think about this when they're in a job search. They think about the reputation of a company. Have I seen this company in some of these high-profile breaches? You know, how do people feel about this company? How is it regarded? They definitely think about that. And this is interesting. We've had some long discussions around our trends about this. You know, the future is going to be more purpose-driven. People are going to be thinking about who they are, the impact that they're having on society individually, and they're going to align themselves with organizations that they feel like share in who they are and can help promote that. So people are not just looking for a paycheck. You know, I mentioned this relationship. Well, I come in, I provide a great day's work, you give me a great salary, you know, we live happily. Hey, that's not enough. That's not enough for people. They're looking for something more. Look at this, 75% of workers say they would take a pay cut to work for a socially responsible company. Interesting. Now I would say there's probably a little bit of a gap between what people say they will do and what they actually will do. I recognize that. You know, you're probably thinking that yourself. But this is important. This is important for people. I guess it depends on the size of that pay cut. But it also depends on where they are. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in employee needs. So keep this in mind as we talk about employee needs. Corporate activism, 56% of employees, I have no respect for a CEO who's going to remain silent on a really important issue. We were just talking this morning at breakfast about politics in the workplace. How, you know, you can't have, you know, politics. That's out the window. You can no longer separate politics in the workplace, in my opinion. And I know this brings some heartache, you know, some challenges for HR professionals. But if you're talking about issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion, how can you talk about that without talking about politics when there's a clear political divide over how to approach these things? When you're talking about other aspects of social responsibility, if you're talking about, you know, environmentalism, global warming, and what your organization might do, there's some political implications for that, right? So it's becoming impossible to talk about these really, really important social issues without politics getting in the conversation. So I think rather than saying no politics, I think that maybe we can offer guidance around how these discussions in our organizations can be more productive. You know, how can we have people with different points of view be able to articulate that point of view without that conflict being destructive? I think that's where we have to be. 93% of leaders agree business should have a positive impact on society. It shouldn't just be the profit motive. The profit motive has gotten a lot of people in trouble. 2 or 3 consumers will boycott or choose a brand based on these issues. So this is where we are. And so once that once that switch is flipped, I don't think you can flip it back down. You know, this is where we are. And so, you know, for organizations saying, hey, I don't want to insult certain customers, et cetera, if you're not proactive about taking a stand and how are you going to do that, you're going to find yourself having to react. And you're always at a disadvantage when you have to react versus being proactive. So part of building trust is meeting expectations. So if you look at this, organizations that are meeting expectations versus not meeting expectations, look at the strong trust that's there for organizations who meet those expectations. This is what I'm thinking of my employer. This is how I think we are. This is who I think we are. And, you know, when you don't meet those expectations, it causes that erosion of trust. We talked about the fact that, you know, compliance is important. So, you know, I'm in California now. So a lot of this stuff starts in California, really following that GDPR approach. So, you know, it happens there in California first. It'll be in Florida, you know, at some point soon. There have been You say not, you don't think so? So there have been some high-profile cases that, we find, and these are just we find out about these because these are the big companies, but there are other companies. This affects small companies, smaller organizations as well. And these have just started to happen, by the way. I think this was really the first year that GDP, look, we gave you warning, now we're going to start to impose these fines. So for some organizations, this is becoming real. And for a lot of us, we work with global organizations, right? We're not just based. So here's some keys around openness and privacy. Treat your folks like customers. Be open about the information you have. Give them control of their data. Let them go out there. Let them do what they want to do with data. There's a movement about people taking control of their data. And they look, I'm going to own my data, and I'm going to decide to sell my data or not you. So stay tuned for that. Ensure that there's value in you having that data. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to make their lives better as a result of it? Make sure that there's a code of ethics. I know at Ultimate Software we have this AI, kind of code of ethics, because it's got to start at the beginning in terms of how you're even thinking about these products and how they're going to be used. And we've already talked about how if we can automate compliance where we can, we're less likely to make these mistakes. So I think this was a quote from in the 90s from Warren Buffett around trust, and it's still very relevant today. So part 3, so things are changing so fast. How do we stay relevant? How can we stay sustainable as an organization? And we think that employees have to be adaptive. So think about this, 23 factors that most influence satisfaction at work. Look at number 1, potential for future growth. Yet, less than 40% of the people feel good about this in their organizations. So think about this as it relates to the the discretionary effort that people put in, the discretionary effort. So I'll do my job, but I'm not necessarily going to do above and beyond. And that's where, good performers and really high performers are separated, right? That discretionary effort. But if I don't think that there's a future here for me, how much am I going to really do that? How much am I going to do that? So this was interesting. So Forbes had an article around the 10 vital behaviors for the future of work, and it was just listed. And we looked at that and said, you know what? Really, a lot of this stuff, EI is at the center. And now I kind of made a name for myself right here in this area over the last 17 years, focused on emotional intelligence. And so many of the things that we think are the skills of the future, they relate to this. I put a little box around these new technology skills because it's still going to be important, right, to have these new technologies. But here's the challenge. As these technologies become obsolete, if you don't have these other skills, you're not going to be able to adjust and learn on the fly and shift and focus on these other technologies, right? You become a dinosaur. And so these skills are going to be critically important. EI should be at the center. EI is one of those things, when it first came out, everybody gravitated to it. You had people who were, presenters and coaches. They would erase the name of their stuff and put emotional intelligence on it. It sounds like this stuff. And so, it got a bad reputation then for a little bit, and now it's come back around to look, there's a real science to this stuff. There's enough research out there now to show that this stuff matters, is measurable, and one can develop it. So we got to focus on that in our organizations. So it's critically important to think about kind of design thinking, as we move forward, using technology to help us experiment, make some mistakes, go back, redo it again. This means in our organization, we just can't have this fear of failure. Making a mistake can't be catastrophic for people. Of course, it depends on how deep, what it is there. But people have to feel like they can make a mistake and be okay. We want them to make mistakes. They have to be able to make mistakes to innovate. And in some ways, technology can speed up that curve. I talked about people they want access to their own information. They want to be able to do things on their own. Having a well-implemented knowledge base helps them do that. Instead of people coming to us and asking HR person, can you do this, can you do that? I mean, they want to be able to go get this stuff myself. Let me go look at it. Plus, I might not even want you to know what I'm thinking about or what my questions are. So this is going to be critically important for people. And this is key. I think people miss this as well. There are all these books about the skills of the future, all these soft skills, etc. But we have a pipeline issue. We have a pipeline issue. So my doctorate is in education. So I've worked with schools, both at higher education. I taught at Jacksonville University. And I've done a lot of work with K through 12. And if we're not working on these skills around emotional intelligence there, then we're trying to change somebody when they're 40 and 50 years old in the workplace. It's much harder. That's what they used to call me in for as an executive coach. You know, here's a 57-year-old person who just really doesn't know how to connect with people. Very, very smart technically, but is really making having a bad impact on the team around him or her. And I would get called in as a coach to try and work with that person. And I'm telling you, it's difficult. It's difficult because people think I have gotten successful. If I made it to this point, I made it to this point because of how I am. They don't realize that you made it to this point despite how you are. And that's the toughest thing, to try to get somebody. So my focus was, look, you have been successful. Imagine how even more successful you can be if we can clean these things up over here. We need to be doing that in K through 12. As organizations, we need to be pressuring that this is our pipeline. We should have more influence. These are the skills that we need. When they show up for an interview, I want to see these skills. We should be threatening schools. I'm not going to recruit at this school unless your students are demonstrating these kinds of skills. We need to be doing that. We got to have more influence there. So organizations are having to do it. Look, we got to do something differently here. And so Amazon, Walmart are good examples of, we see the skills that we're going to need. Let's build something inside our organizations to provide the skills that our future employees are going to need. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. So you got to teach adaptive behaviors, foster resilience. We've talked about resilience. I mentioned this whole part about embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, we got to think of accessibility not just to people with disabilities, but just people who've been left out. We've talked about learning has to be real time, customized. You can't have people coming in the organization and everybody goes through this training class together. 6 months from now, they go through this other training class together. We got to figure out how to make this individualized. What does this person need right now along their own track so that they can have an opportunity? Here's where I want to spend a couple minutes. We've had so many different applications of this employee continuum of needs. You all have heard of Maslow's hierarchy, right? You remember Maslow's hierarchy? And I've rethought that. I don't think in a workplace we're talking about a hierarchy. We're more so talking about a continuum. I've mentioned a couple of times that we need to understand where people are individually, and here's where this really comes into play. That one stat that said, people will be willing to take a pay cut if so-and-so and so-and-so. Well, it depends on where they are on this continuum. And so if somebody is in a survival stage, this means I'm probably paycheck to paycheck, right? I'm barely making it. I don't know what the future is going to bring. I'm under a lot of stress. Life is going to be very different for somebody in that situation than somebody in influence and fulfillment. I'm thinking about the broader purposes, and I may take a pay cut for something that I really believe in. So you got to think about where people are in your organization. And again, I mentioned this has lots of applications. I talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Think about this. You've done a study in your organization, and you realize that you're woefully underrepresented in women and people of color, right? Your numbers are not good. And so you're going to launch this diversity initiative. And so you go out, you're talking to your people, you're trying to get your leaders to understand and embrace this stuff. You talk to a white male that is in survival mode. And you say, look, we don't have enough women and people of color, so we're going to launch this diversity initiative so we can increase the number of women and people of color. I'm a white male in survival mode. What have you just told me? You're out of here, man. We're trying to replace you, right? Yeah. At least that's what they hear. And then going back to politics, we've seen at political rallies these signs that say what? You can't replace us. That is survival mode. That's where they are. You're not going to move them by giving them stats around diversity and inclusion. You got to understand why they're in survival mode. Now, if I'm a white male and I'm in fulfillment, and I hear that we're going to increase the number of women and people of color, what do I say? How can I help? I want to learn from some. I'm tired of looking at the same faces around here. I want to learn. This is going to improve my life. I'm going to learn from people who are different and have different experiences. And so we need to think about, how do we figure out where people are? How do we move them down that continuum so that they're not just in survival mode? Because they're not going to hear what it is we're trying to say. They're going to be too emotional. They're not going to necessarily have the emotional intelligence when you're in that survival mode. It's more difficult. So again, when people have an opportunity to learn, to be adaptive, to show a new craft, it's magic. It's magic. They have this opportunity. They feel like this is a place where I can grow, where I can be different, where I can learn new things. So we have to focus on that. Thank you all so much. I think that's my time. Thank you all so much this morning.
I think we have time for one question.
Question, all right. I don't usually have time for that. What do y'all have? Don't waste this opportunity here. We're good? I'll be around for a little bit, so you can pull me aside if you have any questions.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again.